The PS5 jailbreak is real. Sony is breaking tons of records with the PS5. And did they just buy another studio? How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. I'm gonna get into all three of those news stories I just mentioned, but first I gotta tell you my thoughts on Atomic Heart because I spent a ton of time playing it this weekend after being super excited about it because it's basically like Soviet Bioshock. And yeah, after the, almost decade wait for this game, I gotta say it was pretty disappointing. Like on the surface, this game really speaks to me. It's basically trying to be, like I said, Soviet Bioshock. It's set in a really cool world that takes place during World War II, and it's in a world where the Soviet Union won World War II, so it's like the Soviet Union is a utopia, which is kind of cool to see. There's a bunch of cool guns, there's weapon upgrades, there's humor. It's got like everything, again, that I really like in a game, but once you start playing it and actually get into the meat of what it is, it starts to fall apart really quick because it's very much all style, no substance, and honestly, it really feels thrown together. The intro, like 4 hours, are awesome though. You're in this bunker underground, you're finding all these different weapons, you're fighting different types of enemies that are like these creepy robots, there's mutant zombies, and then it all basically leads up to this boss fight, or seemingly boss fight, that actually ends up just being a cutscene, which sucks because the monster that you're exploring this level to kill is a really cool looking monster, and then the whole fight kind of plays out in a cutscene and it totally kicks your ass. But that's kind of like where all of the coolest stuff in the game happened for me. Like all of the coolest characters. The upgrade system in this game is a fridge that's sentient and it's got a female voice and it's super sexual. Like I don't really know how to say it other than that, but it's absolutely hilarious. You also have a glove on your hand that gives you the sort of plasmid powers. I forget what they call it. I think it's like polymer powers in the game, and the glove is named Charles and it's pretty funny. The issue is the main character is so annoying and he never shuts up. Like he's super charismatic. The actual voice acting I think is really good. It's just the writing and the lines they give him. You can't tell whether or not you're supposed to take anything in the game seriously or laugh at literally everything. And that's just like the tip of the iceberg in this game's problems, because after you get through that bunker, you get thrown into this open world and you have to make your way across it. The map is horrible. The monsters can just wall lock you and kill you, and the checkpoint system sucks. I literally stopped playing the game because I had to climb a tower, but the way I did it, it let me climb the railing of an elevator, and when I got to the top of the tower, the checkpoint rolled over after the cutscene, but because I didn't take the elevator up, I was literally trapped at the top of the tower, and I was like, I don't really want to go back 3 hours to my last save and make my way all the way back here. But its aesthetic is super cool. Mick Gordon's music is also awesome. The weapons themselves, they feel pretty good. Like the combat's a little floaty, but it feels good to play. I think this game would have been much better served if it was a lot more like Bioshock. And what I mean by that is that it should have been a more linear game, but the first few hours are pretty good. And as far as technicals go, it wasn't available for me on PS5, so I played it on PC and it ran pretty well, which is shocking considering every PC game sucks this year. I did use a DualSense Edge and I had to do the Steam input thing that tricked it into thinking it was an Xbox controller, but the game had a setting in the gameplay section that was like show PlayStation buttons, so it kind of knew that people were probably going to use a DualSense to play it, so instead of building in official support, they just give you a little toggle in the menu. I thought that was super cool. Now, because this game is launching in Game Pass day one, I'm assuming it'll end up on PS Plus Extra at some point, and that's kind of when I would probably play this game. There's just better stuff out right now, and this game needs a lot of work, and it's not even like the kind of patch that you wait a month for and then play the game. It's like a patch that basically redoes the open world, so I don't know if it'll ever get that. For right now, I would probably hold off on Atomic Heart unless you have been like so excited for this game for literal years. Then I think it might be worth a shot, but right now I'm sitting at like a 6.5 or 7 out of 10 type of rating. But if I ever go back to it, I'll let you guys know how it ends up. So it's no secret that I have been ripping PS Plus Premium a new one for months now, not really because I hate it or anything like that. I just don't think the value is there. Like it has a lot of features. They're just either A, features that should be free, or B, features that don't really work or aren't supported. Like game streaming, right? Like no one really wants game streaming. It's nice it's there. It's a good way to play PS3 games in lieu of actually playing them on your PS5, which you can't do, and you also can't play them on your PS4, so being the only option, it is nice that it's there. As far as features I think shouldn't be like an inclusion in a higher tiered service, PS3 streaming on PS Now, don't really understand that. The value is not there because the streaming actually isn't great, and I'd much rather Sony just make PS3 games work on the PlayStation 5. And then the other feature that I don't really think is quite there, obviously, is PS1 classics and PS2 classics and PSP PC classics because they have not added any of them. Like they've added a few as the months have gone on, and when you get to play them, the emulator doesn't work all that well, which is super frustrating. And then the third feature that I think should definitely be free is the fact that they've locked demos behind this paywall. You have to pay for the most expensive PS Plus to play 2 hours of a game to see if you like it or not. On Steam, you can buy a game, play it for 2 hours, and if you don't like it, you can refund it for any reason. You can literally say, I just don't like this game, and you'll get your full money back. So they're kind of giving you their answer to that, and it's not very good. Like the timer starts when you start downloading the game, so you never actually end up being able to play the full 2 hours. And honestly, it seems like a feature Sony should just give away for free, because most people, if they go through the trouble to download an entire game and they enjoy that first 2 hours of it, they'll probably pay the full $70. But thankfully, it looks like Sony is at least starting to listen, because this month we are getting some really good classics coming to the PS5, and a lot of them have trophy support. So the first one is an RPG that's like a cult hit in the Sony world. It's a PS1 game called Legend of Dragoon. It was basically like Sony's answer to Final Fantasy VII back in the day, which is a huge RPG that we all obviously know and love today thanks to the awesome remake. But back in the day, a lot of people love Legend of Dragoon, and a lot of people have been thinking that maybe Sony is going to have Bluepoint remake this game, and there have been rumors swirling for a long time now. So seeing it come to PS Plus Premium as a PS1 classic with trophies, that just gives another drop in the bucket of rumors that we're going to get a new Legend of Dragoon game, which honestly seems like a good idea, right? Like 90s nostalgia is big right now. That's a huge franchise Sony had in the 90s that didn't really totally take off, but it was a niche product that people really enjoyed and more people have found over time. That's something that I think is smart to bring back because you can do it however you want. Next up is a game that I've played and highly recommend. I had this game on my PS Vita and it's called Wild Arms 2. It's a top-down style JRPG with great pixel graphics, and what sets it apart from other games in the genre is that it's a Western RPG. Like not Western as in it was developed over here in America, Western as in it's like in the Old West. It's actually pretty cool. So with this whole Activision thing going on right now where Microsoft is basically saying that Sony just buys studios as much as they do and then makes great games that are exclusive to PS5 and never releases them on Xbox, you can kind of see why Sony would want to keep a studio acquisition quiet, right? They'd want to do it in the background and have it not become a huge news story. And it looks like that's exactly what they've done, because my friend Dustin's podcast, Sacred Symbols, they've discovered that Sony may have picked up a new studio called Ballistic Moon. And the more I hear about this studio, the more excited I get. So it's like a 50-person large studio, and they're all made up of people who came from Supermassive Games, which is the company that makes Until Dawn, The Quarry, and the Dark Pictures anthology games, which are all pretty good horror games in my opinion. So you can kind of think about for a sec what type of games this new studio would be making, and it makes sense because Sony probably wants to have a studio like that under their roster, right? Like they had Supermassive, but they never owned them, and Supermassive never really made 10 out of 10 games, which is what Sony is definitely looking to own. They also had Quantic Dream, but because of the weird reviews for Beyond Two Souls and the fact that their games never really sold all that well and all the issues they had with the French government, Sony obviously didn't want to pick up Quantic Dream either. So doing what they usually do, picking up a smaller studio made of developers from a studio that they've worked with before and then shepherding them and making them into a bigger studio, that seems like the Sony way. And as for what they're working on, the game is called Project Bates, which if you are a horror fan, you know that the main character in Psycho is Norman Bates. So are they making a Psycho game, or is this like a slasher movie that you're going to get to play that's in the vein of Psycho? Who knows? But I'm actually pretty excited for this. So how this was discovered by my friends over at Sacred Symbols is that Colin Moriarty, the leader of the show, I guess the owner of the company, he found on a website called Pitchbook under the listing for Ballistic Moon that they're listed as having a parent company of Sony. So that basically means that they were either acquired or merged with Sony, and that's kind of like all the evidence you need because Pitchbook is apparently a really reputable website for stuff like this. And yeah, like I was saying, it just makes sense for Sony to pick up a studio like this. I can't imagine the Dark Pictures games are very expensive to produce because there have been 4 of them, I want to say, at this point, and every time they come out, I look at Steam Charts, which is a website that shows you how many people are playing these games, and it's pretty steady, but it's not really ever that many people actually playing these games. So you got to think about that and say, hey, are these games really that expensive to make? Because they do come out every single year around Halloween. They don't have a ton of actual gameplay. It's a lot of quick time events. It's just walking around in an environment usually. There's no actual combat or anything like that. And the cool thing is they have gotten better with each subsequent game, and they're doing a whole season thing, and they're going to have a season 2. It's just like Sony doesn't really work with smaller games like like that don't sell all that well, right? Like they have indie titles that sell okay, and they basically put those out for prestige, like Stray or something like that, and they usually throw those on PS Plus. But when you have a game that's going to be 60 or 70 bucks that isn't selling all that well, like the Dark Pictures games or The Quarry, you can kind of see why Sony would want to like take a step back, get some developers from this studio, maybe even the best developers from this studio, start a new studio with them, and then build them up from there. Because if they're spending less money on these games and then they're still able to charge full price, that means we're going to get more of them in the future. I'm just happy that this is like a genre now, the like playable horror movie. It seemed like Supermassive were the only people doing it, and they've kind of like fallen back on their laurels a little bit lately, so it's going to be cool to see them have a little bit of competition with whatever Project Bates turns out to be. I just hope it is a Psycho game or like a game inspired by Psycho, because I really obviously like the first movie, being a huge slasher fan, but I also really liked the show, the origin story for Norman Bates with, what's her name? With Vera Farmiga playing Norma Bates. It was an excellent show. I never thought it'd be good, and I was hooked on it. It's like 5 seasons and it's awesome. So with the PS5 being readily available pretty much everywhere now, we kind of knew that Sony was going to have a good end of the year in 2022, but I don't think even Sony was expecting to have as good of a year as they did. Overall, between software, hardware, and everything else related to PlayStation, Sony pulled in $8.8 billion from PlayStation, and most of that money on the software side is coming from God of War Ragnarok, which sold over 11 million copies. And just knowing how available the PS5 was at the end of the year, I'm really curious the split there on how many of those copies were sold on PS4 versus PS5, because you know, they want to sell them on PS5 because they're charging $10 extra. And if you take like 50 copies, $10 doesn't really seem like it adds up all that much. But when you're talking 11 million copies and potentially millions of those copies being on PS5, that $10 compounds a lot more with that many copies sold. So I'm sure they really wanted to sell this game on PS5, and that's why I think they advertised it so much on PS5, despite it running totally fine on PS4. The thing that really sucks as a minor Sony fanboy that I am is that they had those first 2 years of the PS5 where they really weren't able to keep up with demand, and I'm sure they are just completely kicking themselves right now seeing how well the PS5 sold at the end of last year. Like, they're probably looking back and saying, man, if we were able to produce enough PS5s that people want to buy, we would have made so much money in those first 2 years, and this could have been the best-selling PlayStation console ever. I think it still could be eventually, but back when the PS4 came out and that was breaking all sorts of records, people were sitting there saying, man, I bet this will be the biggest PS console ever. But you got to consider that a lot of people bought the PS2, and the reason they did so was because it was the cheapest DVD player on the market for the longest time. But you also got to consider that video games are more widespread and have more mainstream appeal than they literally ever have. So with that in mind, you could kind of maybe see the PS5 ending up as the best-selling PlayStation console of all time. Now we got to talk about the PS5 Jailbreak, because there have been some big advancements here. So we talked about this before. There's a jailbreak for the PlayStation 4 called Manticore that takes advantage of the PlayStation 2 emulator that ships with the PS4 and PS5. If you didn't know, the emulator that the PS5 is using to play PS4 games is like the PS4 version of the emulator running in backwards compatibility. And this exploit, this Manticore exploit, is able to exploit that emulator and basically install any homebrew you want, sort of as a PS2 emulated game. It's kind of tricky, but it has worked on the PlayStation 4, and people have been able to do some pretty crazy things with it. I mean, we just talked about a couple weeks ago how people on the PS5 have been able to hack their PS5 and install custom themes on it. So this jailbreak is quickly trucking along. The one tricky thing though is that outside of those themes, people haven't really, it seems at least, been able to get homebrewed software to run on the PlayStation 5, but they figured out a way with this Manticore version of the jailbreak to make it so that the PS5 can run PS4 versions of these homebrewed apps, which basically means the PS5 has been jailbroken. You're only getting access to the PS4 portion of the PS5, like the backwards compatibility side of it, so you're not actually getting full access to the PS5. So Sony doesn't really have to worry about it right now, and the evidence that they're not worried about it is that they've had 2 major software updates for the PlayStation 5 since this exploit was discovered, and they've never really fixed it. And the current one that's in beta right now also doesn't fix this jailbreak for the PlayStation 5. So as of right now, if you really want to jailbreak your PS5, you can do it. It's just like very limited on what you can actually do. And honestly, I would not mess around with jailbreaking the PS5 at all unless you have A separate PS5, and B, be a separate PSN account. Because if you pirate a game, right, and you play it on your PS5 and Sony figures out that you connected to the internet in some way and connected to your PS account, they will ban you for life. And that's a way worse scenario now than when it happened on the PS3. Like, I'm gonna be real with you guys. I jailbroke my PS3 with my friends Sean and George. We all jailbroke our PS3s, and then you could torrent games and just play them on your PS3. So I played Dead Space Extraction, which was the Wii version of Dead Space that was like an on-rails shooter. They made it a downloadable game for PS3. I torrented it, I installed it on my PS3 with my jailbroken software, and everything worked great. But I never connected to the internet while I was doing it. And if at the time I connected to the internet, my account got banned, yeah, it would have sucked. But at that point, I'd only owned the PS3 for like a year, and digital games weren't even really a big thing yet. So I wouldn't have lost really much of anything. But now, man, if I jailbroke my PS5 and lost all those games, I would be pissed. I have so many games between PS Plus, buying games when they were on sale on the PS4. I mean, I literally just bought Hogwarts Legacy and the Callisto Protocol on digital. So even thinking about Sony banning my PlayStation account is making me really scared right now. Like, I'm actually terrified. You can't see it on my face, but I am in fear right now of losing all my PlayStation games. So if you have an extra PS5 around, if you're like one of 10 people, or I guess us, because we have that one back there, and you have an extra PlayStation Network account, you can maybe try to jailbreak your PS5. I just don't think I'm gonna do it anytime soon.